Great. So the book is scheduled to be released on December 4th, and I believe it's going to be an early release period sometime in November. And I'm excited. I want to first acknowledge many of you over the years who I've had a chance to meet and work with, who have encouraged me to write the book. I originally, to be honest, didn't necessarily intend to write a book. It wasn't something that I considered myself as an author. I really consider myself as a problem solver, and I just set to solve problems at my institution that I originally worked at, Lenore Ryan University, and then that kind of led me to work with other institutions. And so the book was an afterthought, and but it's been very rewarding to pull all of the things that I've used together that have helped many institutions successfully transition students into college. So I'm going to be doing more of these webinars up until the book's release, and also beyond that point. So stay tuned for that, as I'll be making you aware of more of these. And I got some prizes and things like that coming in that I want to just honor you all for taking time to participate in. So you'll hear about how you can kind of get some of those as well. So let's jump in. So the title of this webinar series is called Successful and Seamless Student Transitions. And for those of you who know me, you know that I've had this strong passion and belief that students are far more capable of success than we see and than they experience. And in general, students invest about 16,000 hours of academic work in high school before they ever step foot in college. And that work has prepared them for success in college, but there just needs to be made some adjustments to how they go about doing work, and to how they understand to how they need to relate to the educators, the environment, and to the work that's before them. And so the title of this book is called How to Successfully Transition Students into College. And it's a way for me to, again, express how we can move students from falling into these, what I believe are very predictable traps, and help them, educators, and institutions have more triumphs. So let me start by giving you a flavor of sort of what I believe is part of the essence of the book, is that throughout students' pre-college years, they essentially develop three fundamental relationships. One, a relationship with the environment in which they've learned. Two, a relationship with the educators who teach them. And three, a relationship with the work they undertake. And those relationships form the bedrock of their academic work orientation, and it shapes how they learn and what they learn. So what happens is when students spend their time in the high school environment, there are relationships that are being formed. And those relationships, if we all think about how all relationships form, the key root word to relationships are relating. And so students learn how to relate to the environment. They learn how to relate to the educator, and they learn how to relate to the work. And those relationships are critical, and they are sort of embedded in how they go about navigating academic work. When they leave high school, those relationships come with them into college. And because those relationships, because the nature of the environment changes, they have to learn how to establish new relationships. And I believe that educators and institutions have a key role in helping them develop those relationships. So again, those three key relationships are critical, and those relationships form the basis of how they do academic work. If they don't transition how they relate to the environment, to the educator, and to the work, they're going to fall into one or more of these categories of traps. As you see on your screen, one type of trap is called structural trap. There's another type, functional trap, and there's another one which is called the cognitive trap. Now, there are sub-traps that I go into in the book, but these are the three sections of the book. The first section talks about structural traps, and that goes with number one over there on the left, a relationship to how students relate to the environment. And we're going to spend some time on the structural traps today. And then in subsequent workshops, we'll go further into this, and we'll go into some of the others just to help you get some idea of this. Now, again, let me back up for those of you who came in late. This is going to be one of my less interactive workshops, just because we have some different types of people participating in this, not all educators. So I don't know how much back and forth I can do safely, so to speak, with that. You hear all these things about people Zoom bombing and all that. So I just want to keep everyone, away from those kinds of things. So let's move on. Structural traps, what are they? Structural traps encompass the colossal differences between high school and college classroom settings. Functional traps encompass the profound differences between the high school and college educators, and then cognitive traps encompass the qualitatively different mental labor that is required to do academic work in high school compared to college. So those three relationships make up the basis of academic work, and those also constitute the traps that students encounter. So some of you have seen this before, and I've never really been able to go into detail with it, because this is one of the benefits of this book, is that it allows me to really dig deeply into some of these things that I've talked about in truncated elements over the past. So let me draw this out for you. For many of you, this may be new. I'll try to do this as clean as possible. So on the left-hand side of your screen, what you see is the high school structural environment. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see the high school structural environment. On the right-hand side, you see the college structural environment. And what happens is students learn those relationships that I mentioned with the educator, with the environment, and with how they do academic work are forged in this environment. And let's examine this environment, and then we're going to compare it to what students are encountering now. And then before we leave today, I'm going to share with you what you might be experiencing right now, or students might be experiencing on your campus in this moment. So one is, in high school, students are in class pretty much all day. In the book, I call this continuous scheduling, and it's where they go to class and they're in class all day. I have a high school freshman and I have a college freshman right now. And my daughter, who's in college, one of the first things she noticed is just like, gosh, I have more free time. And she's a scholarship basketball player at a Division I school. And so she has a demanding schedule, but yet she still recognizes that she has free time. She's taking 15 hours at she's a freshman at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is a pretty rigorous academic school. It's actually the second oldest school in the United States, second to Harvard. If you didn't know that, little fun fact. But she talked about when she got there that, even though I'm so busy, I still have time. And that's because in high school, she operated under a continuous schedule. In college, students operate under what's called a gapped schedule. And that gap schedule means they have gaps in between there. And those gaps are important. We'll come back to that later. So for now, just know that there's a difference between the schedule that students are working on, and these are things that are hidden. They know it, but they don't really recognize the impact of these differences. Moving along is that students have many more tests in high school than they do in college. Now, why is that important? One reason is because in high school, students are getting assessed along the way. In the book, I call the high school environment a conveyor belt system, a conveyor belt of learning system. And I'll read this little excerpt that'll hopefully give you some idea of what I mean by that. American high school classroom provides students a conveyor belt model of learning. If they do the activities that teachers place along the conveyor belt, then they will succeed. Those who are particularly focused and capable will excel. The structure of the work and the infrastructure that facilitates the work automatically regulates the work for students, enabling them to achieve more with less effort. However, when students graduate from the conveyor belt model of high school, they begin to realize that something crucial is missing. While they likely cannot articulate what this something is, they realize that simply going to class and studying, however they conduct it, no longer assures success, and they recognize the absence of the learning experience they once took for granted. So that's what students experience, and you may be experiencing that, or your students may come to you, either if you're in a learning center or if you're in a classroom, and they just feel like, there's something's missing. I feel like I don't have enough information for the upcoming assessment. Since it's been about 4 or 5 weeks, students are either have had or are gearing up for their first assessments. And so that's a big difference for students. In high school, students will have gotten multiple assessments and feedback already from to let them know sort of how they're doing. They would have gotten quizzes and so forth. And then in college over here, they're only going to have 3 to 4 tests or assessments. And so there's a greater time before they get feedback. And there's also a greater time distance between when they are actually assessed. And that's, neither one of these are good or bad. I'm not making a judgment on whether high school is bad or college is bad. What I'm saying is that these differences make the basis of these transition traps that I cover in the book. So those fewer tests and the gaps in between tests relate to the next item on our screen, which is the chapters of information. And those chapters are sort of representative of the quantity of information that students are responsible for. So essentially what it's saying is, on the left, students are responsible for or covering a lesser volume of information than they are in college. And so as a result, students, because college is assessing students on deeper types of knowledge, then they need to acquire more information before they can actually operate at the kind of deep levels that they're typically going to be assessed on. And so naturally, they're going to be assessed fewer times in college than they are in high school, but those assessments are going to usually be much deeper. And that leads to the cognitive traps. Is now students have to do a different type of mental work and invest a different type of mental labor in their work in order to do the type of work that college educators are assessing. And then finally, the roles that the teacher and students play. In high school, the teacher plays a pivotal role in helping students succeed. On that conveyor belt, as I use that metaphor in the book, the high school teacher is putting out activities, homework, assignments, quizzes, and so forth all along the way as he or she is preparing students for the upcoming assessment. The high school teacher is very mindful of what's going to be on the assessment, and their role in many ways is to prepare students for success on that upcoming assessment or future assessments. Well, in college, the college professor does not see that as their role, and so students have to take a greater responsibility for what we call independent learning. And what that involves is doing many of the things that the high school teacher did for them, reinforcing their own learning, doing things, reading supplemental material and all these kind of things. However, one of the key points I mentioned in the book is that students can't do this themselves. They need some structural and some infrastructural help from educators in order to do this type of work. So in general, if I can pan out and kind of go over the whole big picture here, the reality is that students have learned how to do academic work in a particular environment. They formed a relationship with that environment in high school on the left. They formed a relationship with the educator in terms of how the educator works with them, how the educator functions, and what role the educator plays. And then they've also formed a relationship with the types of cognitive skills that they're going to deploy to do academic work. And when they come to college, all of those things shift. And now the type of relationships must change with the environment, with the educator, and with their mental work. So again, I just want to stress the teacher's role in this, because the teacher plays a huge role in students' success. And you think about the way high school teachers are trained, is that they're trained, they create lesson plans. And this is a skill set that involves taking complex material and breaking it down into manageable pieces so that students can navigate those much more successfully. And so students get accustomed to that, and they have this relationship, this bond, and this understanding of what academic work entails and what the relationship with the educator entails in high school. And then when they come to college, all of a sudden, they know they have to work harder. Data from, there's a lot of data that shows us that students do acknowledge that college is supposed to be harder, and it's going to be, it's going to require more work. But what they don't really account for is how these relationships differ that they've been so accustomed to in the past. So these transition traps don't happen immediately. So right now, we're about somewhere around 5 weeks into the semester for many institutions. Some of you may be a little further along, some of you may be a little back, but in general, students are in this part right here where they are in what I call transition challenges. These are nondescript events that occur below students' radar. They're not really aware. They may not rise to the level of triggering some of our academic alert systems. Everything may seem to be going fine, but there are signals that I'll show you that we can look for right now to determine if and how many of our students are beginning the early stages of transition traps. Now, let me back up and give you a metaphor and a story that I share in the book in the epilogue that really inspired this book. It's been about 3 years ago. I'm actually going to come off the screen, off the PowerPoint here briefly, just so I can share this metaphor, this story with you, because I think it'll be enlightening. If I can get my mouse to work with me here. Here we go. I'll come back to this slide here in a second. Just want to come full screen here. So about 3 years ago, my family, let me say, my family rents a house, beachfront house every summer where we all get together and we kind of reconnect for the summer. I know some of you may do the same. And we were at the beach, and it was 4th of July. We usually do it over the week of the 4th because that's the week that most people can, have available. And while we're at this beach house, we noticed that this one particular year, about 3 years ago, there was about 13 rescues from the beach. Now, the lifeguards had the red flags out. It was really choppy. Wasn't, like super dangerously choppy, but they did have the red flags indicating that there were rip currents in the area. And so many people were at the beach because it was the 4th of July. So you had a lot of experienced people who were at the beach, and you had a lot of novice people who were just going to the beach. They go maybe once a year, a couple times a year. And so we saw the lifeguards have to go into the water and rescue people 13 different times in one day. I mean, I don't know if you all go to the beach a lot, but that's a lot. I mean, some people have never experienced that over the course of multiple years, and we saw this in one day. More interestingly was that all of the rescues happened in a 10-yard stretch of beach shore, right kind of next to our house. And it was almost like Groundhog's Day. It was like a family would come out and they'd hang out. Next thing you know, you'd see someone in distress in the rip current. Lifeguards would be signaled. They'd jump in, save the person. That couple would, that family would leave, or they would relocate. And because they were in some distress, of course. Thankfully, nobody got seriously injured, but they would leave, and then 30 minutes later or so, another family would do the same thing. And then an hour later, another family would do the same thing. And this just kept happening along the same stretch of land. And so that intrigued me because it reminded me of what I saw in higher education, that every year students start campus. They start the semester off, they start the term off, and they fall into the same traps that their predecessors fell into the previous semester. And then the next year, the same thing happens. And you go back over time, and it's just like, can we at least stop that problem. We know it's predictable. We know it's going to happen. Can we at least do something about that? And that's what I spent my time doing, because to me, these transition traps are very predictable, just as predictable as those ones are on the beach. So you might be thinking, how is it that these people became ensnared by these rip currents? If you understand the way a rip current works, it's actually the most attractive place to enter the beach, because a rip current happens. Imagine a wave crashing all over, back and forth, all over the beach. The rip current is actually the part where the waves are actually not crashing. So it looks like it's inviting you in. You know, if you're looking to get in and not be pummeled by the waves, you find this one stretch of area where there seems to be no waves. Well, the reason there's no crashing waves there is because that's where all the water's receding, hence the rip current. All the undertow is pulling the water back there. So people are attracted to that area, not knowing that that's actually the most dangerous area. So the rip current actually has this allure to it where it sucks people in. And then there's another component that made me think about students. Once you're in a rip current, you don't recognize it at first. You think that you're, having fun, until all of a sudden the grip of the rip current starts to pull you under. And at first, it's like I said, it's nondescript. You think, oh, no big deal, I'll just swim out of this. However, the rip current kind of pulls at your feet, and eventually you are being pulled out further than you originally wanted to go. And then the last thing that I noticed that reminded me of students with the rip current is that rip currents has this insidious way of using our strengths against us, right? So usually people try to swim against the rip current. And so they're trying to save themselves, and they're using all of this effort trying to swim against the rip current, but actually it's futile because the rip current is so strong, they're just swimming in place. And then lastly, one other component is that rip currents are actually easy to avoid and to escape. One is you recognize, like I mentioned, the area where there's not any waves, and you don't go into that area. But then even if you're in a rip current, all you do is swim perpendicular to away from the rip current, just a little bit, and then you swim back to shore. So what it made me think about with students is that students are being caught in these traps. However, they are actually very avoidable. That these traps are avoidable. These traps are easy to identify, and if we understand what to look for, we can ensure that more of our students are not caught in these rip currents. And if they do, in these transition traps, and if they do get trapped, we have the ability to help them. Sorry, my computer's going backwards here. Okay. So right now, your students are they're in these what I call transition challenges, where these things are happening below the current. They're still in that little rip tide where they may not know that they're in trouble yet. But here's a couple of things you can look for. One is your students might be saying, my professor includes all this information in the syllabus, but he never gets through the information during class. This is something that I've actually heard students say to me recently. I'm in class and we have all these notes, we have all these things, but the professor never goes through it. See, this is an early indication of a transition trap, because the student is basing the professor's role off of the high school teacher's role. The high school teacher is going to get through those notes because they know that those notes are going to be reflected on the assessment. And in college, there's a big difference because the professor is going to hold the student responsible for knowing the information, regardless if they actually get through the information. So if your students are right now indicating that they're expecting to get more information from class because they see this assessment coming up, and in their mind, they're doing the mental math saying, well, how can we have an assessment when we haven't covered enough stuff? That's an early indicator that they're in a transition trouble point right now. Another thing you might hear from students is, I don't know what's going on in class. So sometimes students will say that is, I don't know what's going on in class, but I'll figure it out before the test. I love the confidence there, but it's actually probably not going to happen. If students go to a class, and I'll say for any class, and they leave without clarity about what it is that class entailed and how that information, that daily content is supposed to be used, then you can rest assured that that student is starting off on a bad footing, and they're likely in a transition trap. Another thing that you might hear students say is they might say things like, oh, I have so much extra time in my schedule. As I mentioned, my daughter mentioned. And so in the book, I have a managing the daylight schedule that I talk about, that I notice that successful students have that unsuccessful students don't have. Successful and unsuccessful students have the same amount of time usually, but the difference is successful students know how to manage the daylight hours. And I include a schedule in the book that you can use with students that show exactly how they can manage a college schedule to get the most out of the gapped schedule model that college is based upon. Okay, next. One of the key differences between high school and college is that in high school, 80% of the learning happens in class and 20% students do on their own. Well, in college, that's actually reversed. Research suggests that in college, 20% of academic work happens in class and 80% of work happens away from class. Now, that 20% is important. It's critical of what happens in class. I don't believe most students can get the other 80% unless they go to class and get the original foundational 20%. However, students will fall into, in the book, what I refer to as a 80-20 trap. And that's a type of functional trap that students fall into, which is where they overinflate the classroom experience in college. They're trying to get 80% of the information out of class like they did in high school, but unfortunately, they're only going to be exposed to about 20%, and they're going to need to do the mental work to build up their knowledge to get the other 80%. That is a foreign experience for most students. They don't recognize that they need to do that. They don't have the tools to do it. And in the book, I provide a rationale for how to do that, but also provide some tools that I go through about how we can empower students to build up that other 80% of knowledge outside of class. So again, this falls under what I call the 80-20 trap. Let me go back to here just to give you a guide of what you can look for later. So this transition trap here is where these transition challenges are where students are now. Ultimately, and eventually those transition challenges are going to turn into transition trouble. So we're right on the borderline now as to how these transition challenges will turn into trouble. Well, what's the difference? In the transition trouble, they're characterized by a series of unequal performances, because at this time in the semester, students have already gotten some feedback. It's very common for students to do well on quizzes maybe, and they look at those quizzes as gauges of as barometers for how they're prepared for exams. So you go to a math class, you go to an English class, you go to a business policy class, whatever it may be, and you get a few quizzes and you do well on those quizzes. And so as a student, naturally, based on your high school experience, success on quizzes indicate that you are preparing properly for the exam, right? Wrong. In college, quizzes generally assess for a different cognitive mental labor than tests. So students can do very well on quizzes, but yet that not be a barometer of how they're preparing for exams. And that frustrates students. I'm sure some of you have stories of students coming in telling you, oh, gosh, I did well on the quiz, but then I got to the test and all of a sudden everything just seemed to go out of my mind, or I got test anxiety, which test anxiety is often a result of inadequate preparation. Yes, the anxiety is real, but the anxiety is a result of students who haven't prepared properly. And as a result, they know that the stakes of that assessment are pretty weighty. And so the mixture of the weight of the exam and the success they need on that exam or assessment, coupled with the background knowledge that they know that they haven't done well on previous exams, that creates anxiety. That is the nature of anxiety, is when you've done poorly on something in the past and you have to, and that thing has to be completed successfully in the future. That is a crucible that creates anxiety. And the way you solve that is you have to help students prepare differently and better, so that if we change their preparation, we change their test performance. So again, in weeks 6 through 9, you can expect that these things will start to spill over beyond the classroom now. Before it was, I don't understand things in class. Now students are starting to not necessarily get things in their studying right. And so the problem morphs from challenges to troubles. And then ultimately, as you see on the bottom of the screen there, students eventually are in full-blown transition traps toward the end of the semester. And at this point, all the solutions they've tried have been exhausted. Maybe they've tried to change how much they study. They've tried to change the tactics they use to study. Maybe they've tried to get a tutor. Maybe they've tried to do all these other things. But at this point, they just feel trapped. Like, no matter what I do, it's not going to be successful. And at this point, academic apathy manifests as an emotional safeguard. This is when students just begin to push away. I'm done with this. I'm going to focus on something else. And at that point in the semester, that's when we see them show up as our retention casualties, so on and so forth. And so apathy masks inability. Some of you heard me say that before. And what I mean by that is when students who are in college appear not to care anymore, usually if you peel that layer back, you find that they do care or did care at one point, but the frustration and the confusion and the feeling of disempowerment just makes them say, who cares, throw up their hands. They don't really want to do anything with it. But keep in mind that those students do actually care. They're just trapped. But we want to start dealing with those early. So if we start dealing with some of these transition traps early, we can help our students succeed now. So, of course, I can't go into all the details here in the book now because I want you to get to book, but I can share some ideas of a couple of things that you can do right now to help your students, to put your students in a better position to be successful. So let me pause right now and see if anybody has a chat feature, if you have any questions or any feedback on what we've covered so far. Thanks for some feedback. Lindsay says, so far, so good. Any other? See, Lynn says importance of prevention. Yes, prevention is key. If we can get that done. Coaching students is important. Yes, coaching can be very valuable, particularly if we point these traps out to students. In fact, if you all go to my website, there's an article. If you search why good students do bad in college, you'll see an article that I wrote. And on that article has a number of students, a few hundred students who have commented on these. And you'll see their comments on how useful this information been is, just helping them understand their own experience, which I think is the first step. I see Brad mentioned, do these traps apply to adult learners? Great point. So I can speak to this professionally and personally. So my mother went back to college at a late age, who's now passed, unfortunately, but she went back to college in her 60s, and she experienced these traps herself because high school is where students tend to solidify their approach to learning. So whether they're 18 or 80, they're going to apply academic work in a similar way that they did in high school. I've worked with a number of folks who have, worked in factories, or they've worked in, professional settings, or they've worked in, some have been in the military. And we were sitting down with this one military guy who was like a high-ranking person in the military, and he's sitting with me and he's struggling in this history course. And everything, when I started sharing with him these transition traps, he just was, recognizing how, yes, he's still applying, even though he's been through this, military training, he's retired military, he's still going back and applying or approaching academic work in college like he did in high school, because that was his last interaction with academic work. So the short answer is yes, these work for adult learners. some of the comments, if you go back, well, you can't tell who they're, I know who some of the people are. So some of the people who commented on the video are adult learners as well. So I hope that answers your question. So let me skip us ahead to some type of solution we can get to. Now, again, the purpose of this is to make you aware of what the book entails, and hopefully to intrigue you to look at the book and to have your campus explore the book. But let me share a couple of things that you can do right now to help your students get out of those transition troubles and get on the right track. One step is that we need to create a new workspace. In the book, I spent a lot of time talking about the difference between the high school and the college workspace. Let me take a minute and share with you an excerpt that talks about these distinctions. So the workspace plays two crucial roles. Let me back up, start over again. The workspace plays two crucial roles in the high school classroom. It serves as both an essential structural feature and a critical infrastructure system for regulating student learning. Structurally, the workspace provides students and teachers with dedicated time and space to collaboratively engage with the academic material. Functionally, the workspace is a specific segment of class time where students engage in important learning regulation tasks, enabling them to make meaningful contributions to the work. By contributions, I'm referring to students' ability to effectively convert the informational inputs they receive from teachers and other sources into the tangible knowledge outcomes that will be assessed. So what I mean by that is when I observe high school classrooms, what happens is this magical transformation happens towards the end of class, where the teacher will give students something to do and students will begin working on that work. And as students are working, they get a chance to ask questions to the teacher. The teacher walks around the classroom and gives students sometimes specific feedback. Hey, student so-and-so, I noticed that you're looking at it this way. We need to look at it this way. Have you thought about this issue? Have you thought about that issue? So on and so forth. And in this workspace, it's really allowing students to regulate their learning. What do I mean by that? Well, research shows that college students are not very good at regulating their learning. And the reason is because to regulate something, you have to have a clear picture of the end. You have to know what is it that I'm ultimately responsible for knowing. And once I have clarity about the end, I can then situate the daily content that I'm getting in class in a way that helps me sort of gauge and guide my learning along the way. So that's what a workspace entails. So students are accustomed to this workspace. Once they leave high school and go into college, one of the things that they experience that they can't articulate oftentimes is the absence of that workspace. Well, in class, you may experience this in these manners. In class, students might say, I don't know if I'm doing well. I know some parents are on here and your son or daughter may come back to you and say, I think I'm doing okay, but I really don't know. That lack of clarity, that lack of ability to gauge where they are and how well they know the things that they need to know is oftentimes evidence is that they're lacking a workspace. Because in high school, that workspace, they would have clarity. They would know before leaving class, or certainly after a couple of classes, where their knowledge stands. So in other words, to summarize that, in high school, students are accustomed to operating in the workspace. And going to step one of the things we can do on here is create a new in-class workspace. Now, this is somewhat reliant on each professor's or instructor's own instructional style. If you are a instructor who is willing to use some of your class time, especially in the early days, you can carve out time for students to sort of test their knowledge, and you can give them feedback during class on how they're doing. Now, many college classrooms don't operate like that. As I say in the book, students say their professors teach all the way up until class is done, and then they just leave. That's a common approach by many folks. But if you want to create a workspace, you can do that by creating a place where students can test their hypotheses of, do I know this? Is this what I need to know? So for example, in the book, I go through an example of one of my clients, which is a STEM only institution that I've had a chance to work with for a couple of years. And in their math courses, we redivided the math instructional course into segments that include a workspace so that students leave class with greater clarity about what they know and what they actually don't know. Because unfortunately, what's happened is that many students would leave that class believing that they know things that they really don't actually know. And so as a strategy to ensure that they had greater clarity before leaving class, we restructured the workspace, giving them time to test and giving the faculty time to sort of help students adjust before leaving class. So that's step number one. Step two is we can also create an out of class workspace. For those who work in learning centers, this is a great way for you to do this. You can promote this activity. And what this entails is students must begin to take responsibility for converting the daily content into the course learning outcomes. And I'll show you what that looks like here briefly as sort of a teaser, because in the next webinar, I'm going to focus on this a little bit more. Right now, I'm just trying to provide you an overview of the 3 types of traps and then give you a little bit of things you can look at now with your students. And then step 3, establish new labor metrics. Students tend to gauge their academic work by how long they study, how much information they cover. Those are no longer sufficient metrics for college. They're useful, but that's more because the teacher is regulating the learning for them many times in high school, that those metrics will work. But in college, since they have to regulate the learning for themselves, they have to gauge their learning by different metrics. And so on step 3, we want to show students how to use the course learning outcomes as guides and gauges for their learning. Those of you who worked with me in the past, you know I stress this a lot. Unfortunately, many educators don't create great learning outcomes, so they're not always as useful as they could be, but they are essential learning regulation tools for students. And so I'll show you what that looks like here as we close up. So let's say we're all in a chemistry course and you all are in my chemistry course. I'm a chemistry professor, and here are some of the things in my syllabus that I'm going to cover. This is just about 8, but I'll probably cover 4 or 5 times as many of these specific topics. I may give you notes, or I may present on the board and you might take notes on chemical bonding and structure. You might take notes on acids and bases. We might watch video material. I might give you examples of the principles of stereochemistry, so on and so forth. So in other words, over the course of weeks, if I was to look at your notes, you're going to have a lot of information about these and other specific daily content that we went over in class. And what most students are going to do is they're going to study that information with the hopes that if I know this information that we covered in class, then I'm going to be adequately prepared for the assessments that await us. Because in high school, that's what worked. So in college, you figure if I do even more of that, I'm going to be successful. And as I say in the book, students are often logical but irrational. They're right, but they're wrong at the same time. That worked in one environment, but not in the other environment. Here's why. These might be the course outcomes. These are the course outcomes for the course that I have you in. I'll let you look over a couple of those before I advance the slide. Now, if you're looking at these, what you may notice is there's a qualitative difference between the course content, or what students are going to have in their notes that they got from class, and the actual outcomes of the course in which the assessments are derived. So if you are a professor in a class, I'm using chemistry now, but it could be any humanities course, business course, as you see, it could be cake baking to quantum physics, as I like to say. It doesn't matter. But the reality is that there's a qualitative difference between the course content and the actual learning outcomes. It requires students to do a different type of mental labor to get from this in their notes over here to these outcomes. If you're in a classroom with students and your role is teaching students inside a classroom, then you may notice this problem with students because they're going to say things like, well, what you covered on the exam isn't what we covered in class. And you might be perplexed at that, thinking, well, yes, it is. I mean, I am the one who gave you the exam, and I'm also the one who taught the material, so they are. But what they're saying is that on my notes, what I got from class are these specific things here. And what you're asking me for is different from what we're actually, what was covered in class. So that's a level of abstraction that students have to engage in, that I go into the book on what that entails and how to use their mind to go into that type of abstraction. But just know that when professors teach material as experts, they see how all of this works together. So if you're a chemistry professor in here, you see how all these things work together. Unfortunately, students don't have that luxury because they're still novice learning the material, and they have to build from the course content to the learning outcomes. I see Lynn put in the chat feature that course content is the what and versus course learning outcomes is the how. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. The course content is embedded throughout the learning outcomes, but just knowing the content doesn't produce the outcomes. However, conversely, if you do produce the outcomes, then the only way you can do that is to learn the content at a much deeper level. And so in the book, I go into some strategies for surface and deep learning and how students have to shift from what researchers call a surface learning approach to a deep learning approach. And that helps students do a lot better with that information. So here's one tool that's in the book that I've used with institutions to help them. You know, right now, your students are thinking, gosh, I got this test. Can you give me a study guide? Can you give me something that's going to help me figure out what I need to know for the exam? And this is a great tool to use here. As you can see, this is the information students may have been exposed to in class. What they ultimately need to do is they need to have that information, but they also need to be able to extract the concepts that are fundamental to the course as well. And there's going to be fewer concepts, as you can see, than there are terms or daily content. There's a lot more here, fewer information here, and then all of that information is needed to produce one learning outcome. That's the type of mental labor synthesis thinking that students have to engage in that I call macro labor in the book. But unfortunately, many students don't do that. And so they do all of this studying, all of this hard work, all of these noble actions, but they just don't do the necessary work to produce the learning outcome. And I call that pseudo work in the book, work that feels good, looks good, but it doesn't produce the results that we're looking for. And many students and educators are stuck in the pseudo work trap. A couple of comments coming in. Maya mentions the necessity of understanding how critical thinking is a large part of success in the classroom. Yes. So Maya, what you're talking about is critical thinking. I even hate using that word, Maya, because critical thinking is this sort of vague, mysterious thing. I like to say effective thinking. And the reason I say it is because I can define effective thinking, which is, are you using the proper thinking skills on the proper content to produce the appropriate learning outcome? If students aren't doing that, then they're not going to be successful. And then Kathy mentions it means that professors need to write quality learning outcomes in their syllabi. This lines up in the teaching. So I do, for those schools I've worked with, I do a lot with helping faculty reshape learning outcomes. And I'll say this, I have a rubric that I include in the book that lists 6 elements, I like to call them ingredients, that need to be in every learning outcome so that students can do the proper work that I'm describing here of synthesizing the daily content to the concepts to the ultimate learning outcomes. And again, there's 6 elements that I include in that. I call it a metacognitive learning outcome rubric. I've done a lot of work with quality enhancement plans for SACS, COC accredited schools to help them develop these, and they've been very, very useful. So yes, you're right, Kathy, that learning outcomes can be key. However, many educators create their learning outcomes for people up the chain of command. They don't really see them as tools for using, for students to use down the chain of command. So in the book, I talk about that the need to switch from using our syllabus as a document and seeing it more as a tool, a navigational tool for students to guide, engage their learning. So here are some other, thanks for your agreement, Kathy. Here are some other learning outcomes from courses, just to drill down the point that doesn't matter the course you're in, learning outcomes are essential. These are not test questions. These are actually more fundamental than the test questions. But if a course is properly constructed, learning the outcomes will give you a gauge on how you're going to do on all of the assessments, because the assessments are derived from the learning outcomes. So that's what I want to share today. I want to share a little video with you to show you how life could be without these traps. I really find this very inspiring when I see institutions that I've worked with get out of these traps and the success that they have. So let me share a little bit of this, and then I got a couple of other things to share with you before we close up today.
The big early successes is that these students are more confident. They don't seem to be as discouraged when they don't do well on early exams. And really, many of them are just doing better on early exams. We are retaining more students of color and first-generation students in science majors beyond the first few introductory level courses.
They certainly can get there. They can get to making all of those connections, but they don't necessarily, until they step back and see the larger framework, see how all the pieces connect, that's when they find success.
And then an oldie but goodie. Some of you may have seen this before.
My grades lovely. My grades lovely. My grades lovely, because I know how to study. Teach me 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 how to study. All my grades lovely. All my grades, books to page 250, section 2. Read each section and jot down plenty notes, making sure you.
All right, so I'm going to just stop that short just to say that what you saw in those last videos is simply what I like to kind of always showcase is that when we remove these traps, more students will learn better earlier, which will decrease DFW rates, increase retention rates, and increase persistence rates, which all of those lead to those bigger metrics we're looking for is greater completion rates and greater graduation rates. And overall, it produces a greater satisfaction with the academic environment. I've seen that from faculty, from students, from out of the classroom educators and the learning centers and so forth. And so, again, the book reveals the traps that impact students' ability to seamlessly and successfully transition into college. And it shows how we can create more success for students earlier in their academic career. And so, again, this is the first webinar of these. I hope you join me for more of these. I'll get you this video. And lastly, I want to share, I have some new merch that we're putting together to share with folks that I like to give these to students when they have some significant improvement in their performance, is that ultimately we're helping students think, learn, and perform well. And by doing that, they will become better learners. They'll enjoy their academic experience even more. And we all benefit from that. All of us, we all benefit. We can experience what I call the joys of learning. So I hope this was useful to you. I'd love for some of you to check out the Transition Traps website down here and leave comments for me on what you think about this session, what you'd like to learn more about the book. Maybe I didn't cover in this one that I can cover in subsequent sessions. And I'd love for you to share with your colleagues and bring some of them along, because ultimately this book is designed to create a complementary learning environment where students, faculty, out-of-class educators are all working together to achieve a much greater and enduring work. So thank you. Look forward to interacting with you all later. Thank you. I see some folks saying thanks. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. Maya, we can chat. You can email me if you'd like. Let me put my email address in here, so folks don't have to be committed to this screen here, and I can turn off the recording. My email address is learning at the learnwellprojects.com. I do have a couple of meetings with some of my clients here coming up over the next couple of hours, but I'll definitely follow up with you. So Maya, feel free to send me an email. I'd love to chat with you as well. I'll go ahead and end this. So thank you. See you next time.